time to make a return to the world of Android tablets, and I've been pretty excited about this one since ALLDOCUBE is back with another entry in their small form factor tablets. But this time around, ALLDOCUBE is coming back with quite the punch, and is taking their mini lineup to the next level with the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, and brings with it an all-new 8.8-inch 144Hz display, and pairs it with a Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3 chipset, which promises to take ALLDOCUBE's mini tablet to a whole new category of performance, and brings many firsts to the table for the brand. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore this very exciting entry for small form Android tablets, and see if ALLDOCUBE's latest earns the Ultra name, or if it's just a mini with big dreams. It's time to unleash the beast and get familiar with the specs of the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, which brings a lot of firsts for ALLDOCUBE in this space, and right off the bat, the Ultra comes equipped with a beautiful 8.8-inch 16:10 aspect ratio IPS display with a 144Hz refresh rate at a resolution of 2560 by 1600 with a 343 ppi and a max brightness of 500 nits. And if those specs seem familiar, this is most likely the same display found in the Lenovo Legion Y700 2023 version. The Ultra is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, which features 8 cores with a Cortex X4 core and speeds up to 2.8 GHz and an Adrenal 732 GPU and 950 MHz for graphics. This should provide quite the bump up in performance over prior models from ALLDOCUBE, which we'll be looking at further in just a little bit. We've got 12GB of LP DDR5X RAM on board, with 256GB of UFS 3.1 internal storage, which can be expanded through the microSD slot, and this is very much a welcome inclusion, since for whatever reason a lot of the higher end tablets have been omitting this, including a few of which that have been covered here on the channel like the Red Magic Nova and the OnePlus Pad 2. And even the latest Y700 from Lenovo dropped the microSD slot. The Ultra has Wi-Fi 6, 802.11ax, and Bluetooth 5.4 support, as well as a front 5MP camera and then a rear 13MP camera with autofocus and flash support. Unfortunately, the Ultra does not have a 3.5mm headset port, but it does feature stereo speakers and DTS support, as well as one USB 3.1 Type-C port that supports data, charging, and video out. This is all backed by a hefty 7300 mAh battery that ALLDOCUBE claims supports about 5 to 7 hours of gaming and 14 hours of video streaming. And of course, we will be putting that to the test later on in the video. We do get 20W fast charging support here with the Ultra. And it ships with ALLDOCUBE's OS 3.0L, which is built on Android 14 and will be available worldwide shortly with a launch in Japan first, where the brand has been immensely popular. It is priced around 37,999 yen, which is about $270 US. And for now, I will have a link to the Amazon Japan page in case you are interested in purchasing one from there, until it finally makes its way to other vendors like AliExpress and the various Amazon sites. I'd like to thank ALLDOCUBE for sending the Ultra out in advance of launch so that I could spend quality time with the tablet and provide this in-depth video for my viewers. As I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's just take a moment and look around the tablet itself, which seems to take it up a notch in terms of build quality from their prior tablets like the iPlay 50 Mini and iPlay 60 Mini Turbo. We have a metal unibody design that has a very nice finish to it, with small touches like the red accent for the power button, that helps elevate the clean design and hints at its capabilities as a gaming-focused tablet. The Ultra is impressively thin at just 7.9mm and weighs in at around 339 grams, and does this while packing in a ton of features that we've not seen before in an ALLDOCUBE tablet at this size. And it really starts with the 8.8-inch 2.5K display that supports up to 144Hz refresh rate, and this is definitely a step up from prior tablets that we've seen from the brand, with higher resolution, solid colors, contrast, and viewing angles, and in particular with games, it just looks fantastic. And for those less concerned with gaming, the display will certainly pair well with streaming services thanks to its Widevine L1 support out of the box. We've got stereo speakers on board with a speaker on the left and right side when in the landscape format, and these definitely get loud, but I found that the quality suffers a bit when at max volume, and so while nowhere near as bad as the audio experience from something like the iPlay 50 Mini, which only had a single speaker, I've definitely experienced better speakers in the tablet space. Now, you can completely bypass the speakers and the awesome display by making use of the 4K video out through the USB Type-C port. And while this is pretty limited in its functionality, I did manage to go into developer options and force the desktop mode, which I found works much better for video out since it matches the resolution of your display, and for things like game streaming it is an awesome experience that really adds to the capabilities and possibilities of this Ultra tablet. And the Ultra is definitely being marketed heavily as a gaming-focused tablet with specific features like the game mode that can be toggled on, but I found that this is pretty simple in terms of its execution, and all it really does is block notifications, disable gestures, and ALLDOCUBE claims it helps keep apps running at their best, but I really didn't find performance in-game to be any different with it disabled. And speaking of gaming and performance, the tablet itself has a vapor chamber cooling, which again are features that we typically see in higher end phones and tablets, and it's definitely needed here since the tablet itself is powered by the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, which provides quite the boost in power for a tablet this size, and at its price point brings a lot to the table. And so let's dive into the synthetic benchmark so that we can get an idea of where the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra stands in the pack in terms of its numbers, and since this is the first time I've covered the chipset on the channel, I'm curious to see where it ends up, and I imagine that a lot of my viewers might not be entirely familiar with Qualcomm's Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3. So we'll start out with the usual Geekbench 6 for an idea of CPU performance, and the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3 in the Ultra came in with a multi-core score of 5078 and a single core score of 1889. Now naturally it seems fitting to check out the numbers of an earlier model from ALLDOCUBE, the iPlay 60 Mini Turbo, which I've covered here on the channel and is very similar to the Ultra in terms of its form factor. The Turbo is equipped with a Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, and for its multi-core score, it came in with 2,924 and 941 for its single-core score. This is a fairly significant performance improvement for the Ultra over the Turbo model, which represents almost a 74% increase on the multi-core score and almost double the single-core score. I think the most impressive part of all this is that the Ultra is only coming in slightly more expensive than the Turbo model, and so the performance gains just here on the CPU side are quite substantial. And finally, one more tablet, the beloved Lenovo Legion Y700 2023 model, which has the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, and this actually might be the closest comparison to the Ultra since these are identical in screen size, and as such occupy the same market with gaming-focused features. Now, I no longer have my 2023 model, so the numbers were provided to me by Ben from Retro Handhelds, and so I have him to thank for running these numbers for me. The Y700 scored a multi-core score of 4,758 and a single-core score of 1,856, and this is quite interesting since it does appear that the Ultra with its Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3 has just a slight advantage over the Y700 2023, and it will be interesting to see how it fares in the other tests. So let's switch over to the GPU-focused test with 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme, and the Ultra came in with a score of 3,046, with the older iPlay 60 Mini Turbo coming in with a score of 608. Much like we saw on the CPU side, the gains here for the Ultra over the Turbo on the GPU side are quite significant as well, representing nearly a whopping 400% increase, which is pretty insane. Finally, the Y700 2023 came in with a score of 2,793, and just like we saw in the CPU test, the Ultra has a slight advantage over the Y700. And then one last benchmark to round it all out, let's check out the ANTUTU numbers for the Ultra, which came in with an overall score of 1,343,344, and then for the iPlay 60 Mini Turbo, which came in with an overall score of 546,645. Again, we're seeing a massive boost here for the Ultra over the Turbo, representing nearly a 146% increase in performance. Finally, the Y700 2023, which came in with an overall score of 1,325,938, and based on what we've seen, probably not too unexpected, but the Ultra yet again comes away with just a slight advantage over the Y700. Now this is pretty awesome to see overall, since the Ultra's pricing really makes it quite a competitive small form tablet, and for just a little more than what the iPlay 60 Mini Turbo costs, provides a significant improvement in performance over its predecessor while being very competitive to Lenovo's Legion Y700. And while we're discussing numbers, let's quickly look at the Wildlife Extreme stress test numbers for the Ultra, and with its emphasis on its advanced cooling system that includes a vapor chamber, the Ultra does quite well for this stress test. It manages a thermal stability of 93% with the best loop score of 3,028 and the lowest at 2,816, which means we're not seeing too much of a drop off from the high end and should prove to hold its performance long term, which we will investigate further in a little bit. So as we always do, let's grab some external controllers, and I don't want to spend too much time in this section since we actually have a lot of gaming ahead of us, and if that's any indication of what we can expect with this tablet, we are definitely in for a treat. Now since the Ultra is a smaller tablet, we do have access to a lot more options when it comes to telescopic controllers, since more recently, we've seen a trend of telescopic controllers that have targeted tablets like the iPad mini and of course the Lenovo Legion Y700. So for this, let me grab my 3 tried and true options, the Gamesir G8 Plus, the ABXYLUTE S9, and the Razer Kishi Ultra. Right off the bat, we'll start with my absolute favorite telescopic controller, and no, it's not the ABXYLUTE, instead we've got the Gamesir G8 Plus up first, and this one just works great with all sorts of devices, and still more than a year later, I have yet to find one that is as versatile and as solid as this controller. The G8 Plus is a Bluetooth controller, which allows us to also put the tablet into vertical orientation for some TATE mode, which we'll cover in a little bit, but if you are adamant about a physical connection, the original G8 uses a Type-C connector. And a more recent addition is the ABXYLUTE S9, and this one has actually grown on me quite a bit, and surprisingly for the majority of my testing with the Ultra, I was using this specific controller, and I just find it to be very comfortable and solid overall. The S9 is another controller that has targeted the iPad mini and Y700 in terms of compatibility, and because the Ultra is pretty much similar in size to those tablets, the S9 controller fits this tablet without any issues. Finally, we have the most expensive option with the Razer Kishi Ultra. And I really do like this controller a lot, but because of its price point, it does become a very difficult one to recommend since at nearly $150 US, this controller costs almost as much as the tablet that's paired to it. Regardless, I still think it's a worthy option to cover here since again it does specifically target a tablet in size like the iPad mini, and with the Ultra here we are good to go, and of course it has no issues with this device. And so now that we're properly geared up, let's finally head into gaming and check out native Android gaming first. And like I mentioned, we have a lot to cover here since the Ultra, especially when compared to prior offerings from ALLDOCUBE, is substantially more powerful, allowing the tablet to handle all kinds of experiences. First up, you've probably noticed Call of Duty Warzone running in the background, and this is always a great one to test on Android devices, and especially with these smaller form tablets since I can just happily use various telescopic controllers, which the game supports natively. For this game, we do have some options, and you can either target a higher visual fidelity or prioritize higher frame rates and make use of the high refresh display that we have with the Ultra. In the initial footage, I had the game set to use a medium visual quality, high resolution, high upscaling quality, and high shadow quality, and with these settings, the game doesn't allow that 120 frames per second target. But the Ultra has no issues with this level of visual fidelity, staying locked to 60 frames per second. Now, I do want to go back and showcase a bit of the game running at 120 frames per second, and so for this, you will need to go with a low visual quality, and then the uncapped frame rate setting to allow the game to hit 120 frames per second. And the Ultra does a good job mostly hitting 120 frames per second, but it's not consistent and of course is dependent on various scenarios in-game, but for the most part does stay well above 60 frames per second with these settings. Either way, we have plenty of overhead here, which means you can adjust the game just as you like. And it's been a while since I've featured Genshin Impact, but I figured with the Ultra it was a good opportunity to check back in, and best of all, Genshin Impact now supports controllers natively, and I've tested this with the various telescopic controllers that I mentioned earlier in the video. For this video, I have Genshin Impact set to use the highest settings possible across the board, and we are essentially locked to 60 frames per second, which just looks stunning, runs great, and of course there is plenty of headroom here to adjust settings if you are trying to conserve on battery life, but still get plenty of performance. So let's now check out how things fare in Wuthering Waves, which has been a consistent game that I use for testing a little bit more demanding experiences on Android. I've got Wuthering running using a balanced preset, medium resolution, medium special effects with FSR on and shadows set to high. And the only change I made from the default balance preset was to change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. And again, the great thing here is that we do have plenty of room to customize, whether you prefer sharper visuals, higher frame rates, or want to prioritize battery life. The game with the settings I mentioned does very well and looks great and certainly lives up to its balanced name, providing just that as an experience with the higher 60 frames per second, but visually still looks great. And so let's head into the depths of hell with Diablo Immortal, and again this is a game I generally like to test on Android devices because of its popularity, but also because it does scale really well across various devices, but here on the Ultra, it's easy peasy for the tablet and we have everything set to high or very high across the board, which is maxing out as allowed within the game settings using a 60 frames per second target, and the game runs great, it's smooth, and in general, much like the other games shown so far, is really not much of an issue at all for the Ultra. Now let's switch the genres up a bit and check out some racing games, and one that has recently been ported to the Google Play Store and is now available natively on Android is the awesome Grid Legends, which, much like Grid Autosport, is an excellent port to the platform, but also an awesome demonstration of the power that we have on hand with many of our modern and newer Android devices. For Grid Legends, I am set to use the graphics preset, which works great, and the game itself is locked to 30 frames per second, so it's not much of an issue for the Ultra despite the impressive console-style graphics. I will have to experiment more with this game since I know that other Feral Interactive ports have had higher quality presets hidden away in config files, and so I'm curious if the same thing applies here for Grid Legends. And we might as well stick with the racing theme and check out some Asphalt Legends, which I do like testing on devices like the Ultra that have support for a higher refresh display, since the game does support frame rates past 60, and for this one I am set to use the high quality settings, with the only change being made to the frame rate, which I have set to 90 frames per second, and the game for the most part stays locked to that target. And there's not much to say here except that it's fast, fluid, and visually gorgeous, and lots of fun on the Ultra with full controller support. And finally, the big one for many, Fornite, which I think, given the results of the other games before this one, is probably not all too unexpected, but here on the Ultra we have lots of room to adjust settings based on your own personal preference. And so, for example, if you wanted that 90 frames per second target, the game does require you drop the quality settings, but regardless, being set to low quality with a 100% resolution scale and high texture quality, the game does mostly stay up there at 90 frames per second, with the usual dips from the initial drop, but definitely smooths out once on the ground. And if you really prefer the best looking graphics, you can see here that I have Fortnite set to epic settings, and it does in fact hit the 60 frames per second target with 100% resolution scaling and high texture quality, which I think is pretty impressive. So let's now check out how things fare for the Ultra on the emulation side. And just like we did for native Android gaming, we have a lot of ground to cover here, from Nintendo consoles to PC games. The reality is that the Ultra truly lives up to its name, and it's quite an impressive showing here for emulation. If you recall, the iPlay 60 Mini Turbo had some weird issues with emulation, namely on the Gamecube and Wii side with Dolphin, which was a huge bummer for that tablet, but I have very good news, because here with the Ultra and its Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, Dolphin is absolutely soaring out of the ocean, performing all kinds of flips, and if you noticed, I have F-Zero GX running here, which I think for many is one of the more important tests with Dolphin and Gamecube emulation, and we are essentially maxed out here, using 6 times the native resolution of the Gamecube, and performance is just incredible here. This really makes me happy to see, and can I just take a moment and say how gorgeous 6 times Gamecube looks on this display? In general, Gamecube is going to be an excellent showing here with the Ultra, and I did test various other games to great success, but with the metric being set so high with F-Zero GX, we are definitely in a good position here for Gamecube. But the best part is that it doesn't just stop at Gamecube emulation, and the experience is fantastic as well with Wii using Dolphin, and I went with some of my personal favorites to test here, like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, which is a game that has classic controller support, so it maps very easily to a telescopic controller. For Modern Warfare 3, I am set to use 4 times the native resolution of the Wii, and the game mostly does well with some occasional dips, but this is actually due to the game itself and just how it runs with Dolphin. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is another game that is performing really well here with the Ultra, and it looks absolutely stunning, running at 4 times the native Wii resolution, and it's just awesome to see this level of performance in a tablet this thin and small, but more importantly at a price point that has not really been seen until more recently. And we're not quite done with the Nintendo side, so let's check out some Cemu for Android, which is the Wii U emulator on Android, and this actually got another update pretty recently. I have a set of games that are sort of my go-to games when it comes to testing Wii U on Android, from lighter games that run on tons of devices, to games that can definitely push the hardware in different ways. So as usual, I started out with DuckTales Remastered, which on the Ultra is seemingly not an issue at all for the tablet to handle, and it runs well just at its default resolution of 720p. I do think we have room here to possibly take the resolution up, but in general I was just trying to keep things simple here. And since we do have a bit of power on hand here, instead of running Wind Waker with Dolphin on Gamecube, I decided to test out Wind Waker HD for the Wii U, and this is another game that does pretty well at the default resolution with no changes made to the settings, staying consistently locked to the game's 30 frames per second target, with just some dips here and there because of the shader compilation. Now, regulars of the channel know that I really enjoy some fast racing Neo, and just the series in general, which have been Nintendo exclusives on Wii, Wii U, as well as the Switch. Now the Wii U version here with Cemu is very interesting because you can actually adjust the in-game frame rate using the graphic pack settings in Cemu, and so for this game I wanted to see how close we could get to the 120 frames per second target, since we do have a higher refresh display here, and it does a lot better than I expected. The game itself is not perfectly emulated since Cemu is still very much a work in progress, but we are well above 60 frames per second here, and so it's just a lot of fun to see how hard we can push Wii U emulation, and personally I think I'll be exploring this further with the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, but it is just awesome to see how wide open the doors are here on the Ultra. Finally, I think it's time to check out one last console of Nintendo's with the Switch, and don't worry, there will be a little bit of DS and 3DS later on in the dedicated TATE section. But back to the Nintendo Switch, I had a lot of fun loading up a bunch of games and just testing some various settings and drivers. Now for the most part, I just settled on using the latest turn-up drivers, which actually worked a lot better than expected, and definitely provided a noticeable improvement in performance and compatibility over the default system drivers. Now for every game here, I am using the latest version of Sudachi. And much like Wii U emulation, I like to start out with lighter stuff like Box Boy and Box Girl, which I actually haven't featured in some time, but it's an awesome game that does quite well across a range of devices. And I'm sure you're thinking, come on Rob, let's push this tablet a bit harder since we obviously have a lot more power on hand here. And so let's check out how Crash Team Racing Nitro Refueled fares with Sudachi on the Ultra. And I love featuring this game since outside of the Switch port, we really have no other way to enjoy it on Android, and it just so happens to be an awesome remaster of the original Crash Team Racing. This is another game that is running very well in Sudachi using the native resolution, but I am in docked mode, which means that we are running at 1080p here, and the game is at full speed. And finally, another game that is usually very stable with Switch emulation on Android is Metroid Dread, and this is just a fantastic entry in the Metroid franchise that stays true to the classic games with the side-scrolling Metroidvania gameplay. Just like with the other games I featured, I have Metroid Dread running at native resolution in docked mode, and it's another one that has no issues running on the Ultra, and is really a good sign of what we could potentially expect here with Switch emulation. The reality is that there are so many games available for the platform, and Switch emulation is a bit disjointed on Android, which means there will almost certainly be games that require specific tweaks, drivers, or even different versions of the various forks of Switch emulators. Regardless, this is quite exciting and certainly a bigger jump up from what we've seen with the prior ALLDOCUBE tablets. And believe it or not, we are still not done with emulation, and it's now time to switch over to the Sony side and check out some PlayStation Portable first. And for this, I will just jump right in and check out some God of War Chains of Olympus, which as always is everyone's favorite benchmarking game for PSP, but does serve as a decent baseline of what we could potentially expect for other games using PPSSPP. And here with the Ultra, I am set to use a whopping 9 times the native resolution of the PlayStation Portable, which is just absolutely ridiculous and completely unnecessary given the panel we have here with the Ultra. But it certainly bodes well for the majority of the library, which for lighter games like Loco Roco, you can easily expect to max out the upscaling at 10 times, which is the limit for PPSSPP, and so PSP is definitely in a good place here on the Ultra. But this was a console that fared well with the iPlay 60 Mini Turbo. So let's kick it up a notch and now check out PlayStation 2 emulation with Nether SX2. And like usual, I've got my go-to games I love checking out with Nether SX2, and I've got a set of racing games that I adore up first with Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast here. And this is generally a good game to test with PlayStation 2 emulation since it does have areas that can be a bit problematic. But here on the Ultra, I am set to use a 3.5 times native resolution, and Outrun 2006 is just flying here, running nice and smooth, and it just looks gorgeous at this upscaling on the Ultra's display. The same thing can be said for another awesome racing game on PlayStation 2, with Burnout Revenge likewise running at 3.5 times native resolution, and again the performance is just excellent, staying locked to its frame rate with really no issues to speak of. Finally, I have to bring in some God of War 2, which is always one of those baseline benchmark games for PlayStation 2 emulation, and just like the other games, I am set to use 3.5 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution, and performance is phenomenal with no issues at all with any frame dips, and we will see in just a little bit that performance is consistent throughout multiple hours of gameplay with the battery testing section coming up shortly. The long story short is that at this point, the rate limiting step is the emulator itself, but even then I believe that most games can be brute forced with the power on hand here, and the majority of the PlayStation 2 library will run well enough even for the more problematic games. And I'm curious if anyone wants to see a RetroTech style showcase of PlayStation 2 emulation with this chipset, and definitely let me know down in the comments if that's something you think would be worth doing here. And speaking of retro tech dad showcases, many viewers of the channel know I really have been enjoying Winlator on various devices, and I have covered it in various videos on different devices, and given that we have a new to me chipset, and a Snapdragon one at that, I had to check out a bit of Winlator, which allows us to run our PC games on the Ultra tablet. For this, I am using the latest version of Winlator, which is Winlator 10, and I start out with a tried and true game that has a very high success rate on lots of different devices. And yes, this is the Game of the Year edition of Tomb Raider 2013, running on this ultra compact tablet at more than 60 frames per second with a resolution of 1280 by 800 and low settings, which tells me we can comfortably adjust visual settings with this game. I don't believe I've ever showcased Grand Theft Auto 5 running through Winlator on the channel, so why not? No better time than now to check this out, and I am likewise very pleased with the results of Grand Theft Auto 5 on Winlator, which hovers around 60 frames per second using a resolution of 1280 by 720 and just the normal settings across the board. It's really remarkable how far Winlator has come, and it's just something that I very much enjoy experimenting with on various devices, and to me it's absolutely mind-blowing to see a game like GTA 5 running on a device like the Ultra. Now, it's not perfect by any means, and Winlator still requires a bit of experimenting, but this is more to showcase that the potential is definitely there. And for reference, GTA 5 is running better here than on some actual x86 mini PCs that I've tested for nearly the same price point. I almost forgot, but I did mess around with some PlayStation 3 emulation using the RPSX emulator that has recently dropped, and this is very much early in development, so don't expect any miracles here, but I did manage to get a few lighter PSN style experiences running better than expected with one of my personal favorite PS3 games, Resogun, doing quite well here, and it's just really neat to me to see this running here. And I am so excited for the future of PlayStation 3 emulation on Android, which will only get better over time. And there's just one more thing we need to cover with emulation, and that of course is the return of TATE mode. And with a compact tablet like the Ultra and its predecessors, one of my favorite use cases is turning the tablet into its vertical orientation, and then using the Gamesir G8 Plus, which can handle it in the vertical orientation since it doesn't have a USB-C connector obstructing it. And unfortunately, unlike the Legion Y700, we don't have that second USB-C port, but no worries because the G8 Plus is a very solid workaround for that, and because we have a bit more power under the hood, we can enjoy various shmups, which there were a ton of on the PlayStation 2, and games like Homura and Mushihime-sama all work great here using that same level of upscaling that I talked about earlier in the emulation section. Another very popular use case for this setup is, of course, Nintendo DS and 3DS emulation. For DS emulation, the Ultra will obviously have no issues handling emulation given the power we have on hand here, and I do really like the way DS games present on this display in the vertical orientation since the DS used two 4x3 screens. Now for the 3DS, I will say that I actually prefer 3DS in the horizontal format since less games really utilize the bottom screen for the 3DS, and so I just like having the large main screen, but regardless, 3DS emulation is very solid here because of that Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, which can handle 3DS emulation quite well, and best of all, with the screen real estate and flexibility, you can choose to play the 3DS the way that works best for you. For this video, I'm using a more recent 3DS emulator called Azahar, and games like Metroid Samus Returns, New Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario 3D Land, and Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed work really well with as much as 4 times the native 3DS resolution, so the image here is just crisp and beautiful. The usual frame rate dips from shader compilation do happen here occasionally, but honestly it's very minor, and for the most part, 3DS is just another platform that fares well with the Ultra. Finally, one last and very awesome use case for a tablet of this size is the ability to enjoy things like game streaming either through cloud services like the GeForce Now and Xbox Cloud, or local streaming with a setup like Artemis and Apollo. Tablets this size really feel like they were made for something like this, with the ability to easily snap on a telescopic controller, and then suddenly you've got yourself an awesome gaming setup for streaming with a much bigger screen than most of the dedicated handhelds that we have in the space. As usual, I tested some Artemis with Apollo on my local PC, streaming some Hades 2 at 144 frames per second, fully utilizing that 144Hz display on the Ultra, and for this I kept it at 1080p since I really wanted to focus on pushing those frames. Now it's definitely fortuitous that the latest build of Artemis made improvements to its low latency features for newer Snapdragon chipsets. And thanks to TypingCat over on the RH Discord for letting me know about the update, I was able to test this ultra low latency setting, which is experimental, but I can confirm does have an impact with the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3, and streaming at 1080p Pushing 144 frames per second, we are looking at around 4 milliseconds for the average decoding time, which is just phenomenal, and I think the Ultra will prove to be a great way to enjoy local game streaming. And we definitely know we're getting close to the end here, since it's now time to check in on battery performance with the Ultra, and as usual I conducted various tests to get a sense of what we can expect with the tablet in different use cases. The nice thing with the Ultra is that it has a fairly substantial battery for a tablet this size, coming in at 7,300 mAh, so let's see how it fares in the real world, and I'll start out with the lightest test, which is the endless YouTube streaming, one of my favorite channels, Classic Game Room, and for this test I am set to use 50% brightness, 50% volume, with the Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and the battery saver option turned on, at a streaming resolution of 1080p, and we came in at just over 13 hours of on-screen time, which puts it pretty close to ALLDOCUBE's claims of about 14 hours of video streaming. Next up, we have some light emulation using Mega Man X2 for the Super Nintendo with the same 50% brightness and volume, Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and the battery saver option still on, and for this test we managed to come in over 10.5 hours of on-screen time, with a telescopic controller attached to the tablet, and that's really solid performance here, again, for a tablet this thin and light at its size. Finally, the heavier emulation test with the usual God of War 2 for PlayStation 2, and I am set to use 3.5 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution, so we are definitely pushing the hardware here a bit, and with the same 50% brightness and volume, with the Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and the battery saver option turned off, we managed just under 4 hours of on-screen time, which is really solid, and again, this is done with a good amount of upscaling, but the best part is that the device did not seem to have any issues with thermals, managing to keep that 60 frames per second target throughout the entirety of the battery test at 3.5 times native resolution. And so, that does it for my coverage of the ALLDOCUBE iPlay 70 Mini Ultra, which really is an impressive package for its price, and is very much a nice upgrade from their prior devices at a price that is fair, and brings with it a lot of features that I think will make many happy to see. I really like the direction that ALLDOCUBE has been moving in, and with each tablet they clearly bring meaningful improvements. Of course, not everything is perfect here, and one area I'd love to see ALLDOCUBE step it up in is in terms of software support, with more frequent and needed updates to their devices that will add to their longevity. Now, as long as you're willing to concede in some areas including software support, the iPlay 70 Mini Ultra really is a nice package, and easily their best to date. And so, with that, what do you think about the Ultra, and will you be looking to pick one up in the future? Definitely let me know down in the comments your thoughts, but until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.